Thank you for joining us. My name is Janet Pence, and I'm with the Yorktown PTA, and I help head up the Yorktown PTA Family Network. And I'm completely delighted to have the opportunity to introduce one of my favorite presenters, also somebody whose blog I have enjoyed. She provides just a ton of free advice all the time. She's always happy to give parents a helping hand with the joy of raising our children. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about her. Her name is Ann Dolan, and she has a strong conviction that school doesn't have to place stress on children and parents. Based on her nearly 30 years of experience, she has developed practical strategies that she shares to help kids succeed and make the most of their academic journey. Ann is a former Fairfax County public school teacher, mother of two, author, and advocate for kids with learning differences. She founded Educational Connections in 1998, tutoring one student at her dining room table. Today, her company has grown to employ more than 120 tutors, executive function coaches, and college consultants who provide virtual support to K through 12 students in the DC area and beyond. So, Ann, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real privilege to have you.
Thank you so much, Janet. It is great to be here, and welcome everybody. As Janet mentioned, my name is Ann Dolan, and tonight we're talking about the SAT and ACT. Should your kids take these tests, or should they skip them entirely? And what is the role of testing within this different environment where so many schools are going to a test optional model? Well, we're going to talk about that tonight, but I'd love to know if you have a question that's floating around in your mind. Throw it in the chat. I'd love to know what you're thinking. What brought you here this evening? What question would you like answered? That would be wonderful. All right, I'm also wondering what grade your student is in. When will your student graduate from high school? I'm going to put up a poll in just a second. Oh, there it is. And if you could tell me if your child is a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, or maybe a younger student, that would be terrific. All right, let's see. We've got some sophomores and juniors. We don't have any freshmen or seniors, and that makes sense for seniors. They're probably already finishing their applications now. Oh gosh, okay, mostly parents of juniors. So 67% of the parents that are here tonight are juniors, have kids that are juniors, and 33% have sophomores. So that's super helpful. Thank you so much for that information. All right, so let's talk a little bit about your concerns before we get started. Nicole asked, what's a strong SAT score to send to colleges? Well, Nicole, we know that 36 is a perfect score, and some schools will want high scores, and then some schools are, closer to that range, to the end of the spectrum of 36, and some schools will be okay with lower scores. This evening, we're going to talk about that in terms of what that mid 50th percentile for each school looks like, and then when your child should submit a score, and maybe when they shouldn't, because the score won't help them. Rosemary asks, if the school says they are test optional, can you really believe them? And there's a difference. Some schools are test optional, but they still do take into consideration test scores. But some schools are test blind, and that means they absolutely do not pay any attention to test scores. So we'll talk about those differentiators this evening as well. Thank you both to Nicole and Rosemary for submitting those questions. So let's get started. What has changed with testing since COVID? Well, certainly the test optional movement was already in full swing before COVID came to be. And many schools across the country were saying, we're not sure if test scores make a difference. Yes, they definitely help predict how, sorry about that. They definitely predict how well the student will graduate in 4 years. In fact, it's a better predictor of students graduating in time than grades. But in terms of students doing well in college, grades are the better predictor. So colleges said, well, it's not really fair that every child can't prepare and take an SAT because it costs money. maybe we should be test optional and forego tests. And so that was happening well before COVID, but COVID accelerated it. And when so many kids couldn't actually take a test, there were so many cancellations, the momentum gained a lot of speed. And so that's what's changed, is that now the vast majority of colleges throughout the country are test optional. The ones that require a test, those tend to be the more competitive schools, or the schools that have blanket university standards. For example, in Florida and Georgia, if you want to go to a state school like University of Florida or University of Georgia, you have to submit a test. It's just part of the framework of their college system. So the question begins, should your child take a test? And test scores, to the question earlier, is it really true that it's optional? And the answer is generally yes. However, a test can really help your child. When there's not that many data points, namely grades, what are your child's grades and how many AP, IB, or dual enrollment courses have they taken? When there's not another data point, it's hard for schools to make decisions. So a test can help, especially for a student that has mediocre grades. A test can really help, or a student who's applying to a very competitive school and they need another data point to stand out. Test scores can indeed help kids stand out. In fact, we know that colleges are getting more applications than ever before. The Common App is saying that selectives colleges are receiving more than 25% more applications than they were before COVID. And not just, our flagship schools like UVA in Virginia or Virginia Tech or William and Mary, but even slightly less selective schools like JMU, they're seeing more applications than they did in the past. Even schools that aren't very competitive, both private and state schools, have reported seeing a 17% increase in applications through the Common App. So let's take the example of Virginia Tech. They received 45,000 applications in 2022. They received 42,000 applications in 2021. And prior to that, it was even less. But it's super competitive because they only have spots for 6,700 kids. It doesn't mean that they're only going to select 6,700 kids. Certainly, they're going to accept more because some kids will choose not to go there. But you can see how competitive it is. So you want to know, when my child is applying, could a test score set them up for success? So that's where we land now. And this was one of the questions we talked about in the very beginning. What is a good test score? Well, it really honestly depends where your student wants to go to school. So let's take, for example, William and Mary. This is a picture of William and Mary. It's a beautiful campus. It's a small school. It's definitely smaller than the other universities that are very popular in Virginia. So for that reason, they have fewer spots. So as an example, at William and Mary, for the class of 2023, the 50th percent range for the SAT was between 660 and 740. And keep in mind, a top score is an 800. So those are very strong scores. And in math, it was a 660 to a 770. On the ACT, the average freshman going to William and Mary, they earned between a 30 and a 34. So our recommendation is that you submit scores that are in the very top range of that, like a 33 or a 34, maybe a 32, possibly a 30 or a 31, but maybe not. It might not help you too much, but you definitely wouldn't want to submit, say, a 28 or a 26 or a 25 on the ACT because it wouldn't help your application. You want your data to help you stand out. The other thing that's important to note about test scores is that you own the data. So you don't have to submit a test score if you don't. If you take the test twice and you're not happy with any of those scores, you don't have to submit any of them. But chances are, when you build your list, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, you really need to have a smattering of reach schools, of target schools, and of safety schools. So it could be the case that, let's say William and Mary is on your students list, maybe that's a reach school for your child. So perhaps they won't submit their test score to William and Mary, but maybe they have other schools on their list where, let's say they have a 30. That 30 is a really impressive score, and they should submit it to those mid-range schools, those framework schools, those target schools, and those safety schools where, it's a good chance that they'll get selected. But you own the data. You can submit your scores how you want. It wasn't like that. I remember when my older son, he's 24 now, and he went to JMU, and he had to submit his scores to every school he applied to. Every school, he didn't own the data, so every school wanted to see a score, first of all, but every school wanted also to see all of his scores. And it's not the case anymore. It's very different. So now you own your data, and you can choose to submit it how you want. So for the most part, taking a test can be helpful because there's somewhere along your list that you're going to be able to use your score to your advantage. So the pros are that a test score gives your child another data point. And if it's in that range, or definitely at the middle or the high end of the range, it makes you look really good that you've taken a test and you have this other data for them. The other thing is that some schools will require a test. There's lots of schools out there that still want a test. And so you might have one of those schools on your list. Furthermore, the requirements are changing. The test optional movement gained speed during COVID, but many schools, William and Mary included, said, we're going to do this for a while and see how it goes. For example, I went to Boston College for my master's degree, and I got the monthly booklet in the mail, and there was an interview with the dean of admissions, and he said, we really see this as a holding pattern, as a place to look at the data to see, are the kids that submitted test scores and were accepted, do they do better than the kids who didn't submit a test score? And so we're not saying we're always going to be test optional. We want to look at the data this year and then make a decision for future years. So if your child is a freshman or maybe a sophomore, it could be the case that when they apply, when they're a senior, a school that's test optional now may want a test in the future. But here are the cons. It's one less data point. So when you don't submit a score, the schools are going to look at other things. So they're going to see, you don't have a score. Let me look at your grades a little further. Let me delve into your course selection. How many challenging classes did you take? How about your extracurriculars? Have you differentiated yourself as a student? So they may dig a little bit deeper into other parts of your application because they don't have your test scores to look at. So are you submitting a test or not? Again, it depends on where you're applying, but even if you're not sure right now, what we recommend is that kids take a practice test. And I know that Yorktown offers tests. We also offer them on weekends where we offer them virtually with a live proctor, where kids can roll out of bed on a Saturday and start taking a test at 9 o'clock. And a proctor, walks them through. These are retired tests, so they're extremely similar to the tests kids get now. And I'd always recommend anytime your child takes a practice test, wherever it is, they should always be taking retired tests. You don't want some test that somebody made up. It's not the same. It's not the same as what the College Board is using, or the College Board produces the SAT, or the ACT is producing. So a practice test can help you determine where your baseline is. So when you take a practice test, and we recommend that kids usually do these in the spring of their sophomore year, the summer before their junior year, or in the fall of their junior year, could be even the winter of their junior year. That practice test, where nobody else has the data, You're not taking it through the SAT or ACT. It's not a real test. This is your own information. It can provide you with a baseline score. So all right, on the ACT as an example, I'm starting with a 28. The schools I'm looking at, are going to want to see maybe a 30 or a 32. I have some improvement that I need to make. And so you have a starting point. A practice test also helps kids get familiar with the real environment. Yes, they've taken a PSAT already, but the SAT is different and the ACT is very different. So taking a test under simulated conditions provides kids practice with the content that they're going to see on the real test, pacing, how long they have for each question, and stamina, because these tests are. So you're going to take this late your sophomore year, the summer before your junior year, or early in your junior year. If this is of interest to you, again, I know that Yorktown offers practice tests, and we also do too. And these are our upcoming mock test dates. They're $20, and they're easy to sign up for it. You can scan this QR code, and it will take you right to our schedule, and you can sign up for an upcoming mock test date. All right. So in a perfect world, kids, juniors, will take a practice SAT and a practice ACT. Now, the reality is that maybe that doesn't happen with everybody. Sometimes kids will say, oh, I already took a PSAT. I don't want to sit for the real SAT. I know how that works. And they might just take a practice ACT. So that's fine too. We encourage kids to get a flavor for the ACT because sometimes kids do like that one better. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ins and outs of the test in a second. But the reason it's helpful to take a practice SAT and a practice ACT is those scores can be put into a concordance table. And this concordance table was agreed upon by the College Board and by the ACT. So these are common data points that allow you to see, based on your score, if you got here's an example, a 31 on the ACT, that's about a 1400 on the SAT. And it allows us to see which test you score best on, because about 33% or about a third of kids have a clear, there's a clear indication. They're better on the SAT than the ACT, or they're better on the ACT than the SAT. So it's super clear that one test is in their best interest to prepare for and just take that one test. Every score in America takes both these tests. You don't have to practice for both, study for both, and take both. You really don't. You need to figure out what your best test is, stay in that lane, and practice for that test and take that one test. But for about 2/3 of students, it's a toss-up. They score about the same on both tests. So when that happens, we ask kids, which test did you feel most comfortable with? And it's often a case that kids will say something like, I like the SAT. It feels comfortable. I've already taken the PSAT a few times. I knew what that was about. I like the pacing of it. Other times we'll hear kids say, actually, I like the ACT. It felt more straightforward. I understood what questions they were asking me. With the SAT, it felt like I wasn't quite sure. The language was tricky at times. I wasn't sure what they were asking me to do in the math problems. So we hear both of those things from students. But this actually helps us to understand with numbers which test the student does best in. And if not, then what's your preference? And kids often have a clear preference. All right, so I mentioned that every school considers both tests. And sometimes parents don't believe that. They don't think that that could be the case, but I promise you it is. It doesn't matter. Schools do not have a preference. It's not like one school likes the SAT over the ACT. It doesn't work like that. schools are used to seeing both sets of tests. So it really doesn't matter where your comfort level is the most important thing. All right, so I'd love to pause here and see if you have any questions. Let's see, I have a couple here from Elena. What are the best SAT-free resources for students with learning differences in his family? So what I would recommend, if your child has extra time, I'll talk about this in a second, but I'll bring it up now too. If the accommodation is time and a half, which is the most common accommodation on the SAT or ACT, I would think very seriously about the ACT. The difficulty in the ACT is actually the pacing, the quick speed of the test. However, when you take that away, and that's not an option, that's not an issue because now your child gets extended time, the test feels so much easier. So for most kids with accommodations, they go with the ACT. And there's lots of free resources. The ACT itself, when you register, you have to pay for them, but they're not very expensive. They have resources. There's also lots of other resources online. Naviance, many schools use that. They also have free resources. But there's so much stuff that you can find, but just by Googling. But I would recommend seeing first what ACT has and looking at Naviance as well. Let's see. Do the mock tests allow for extra time accommodations? We have extra time approved for the College Board, but haven't navigated the ACT request yet. How should we navigate mock tests? We do have kids take them under standard conditions. And for students with extra time, we give them, they can take that extra time on their own. And then once they finish, we'll grade the test. So we don't have a mock test where it's only extra time. We don't have enough kids for that. We used to do that, but we'd have sometimes no kids sign up or one or two kids or one kid typically. And so we haven't been able to offer that. So when we do have a student needing extra time, they'll still take it with a group and then they'll take their test and just finish it during the more time at home, and then we'll score it for them. I have a sophomore. Should we take the SAT before the change in the test pattern or after? What are the pros and cons? And you can certainly take it both and see. So you can take it as a junior. I would recommend that and seeing how your child scores. And then they can take it again later on. There's nothing wrong with taking it in both formats. And for a lot of kids that are in this transition period, I would recommend that. And that way you have options. Thank you for those questions, everyone. All right, so let's talk a little bit about both tests and the type of test which might feel right for your child. So as I mentioned, the only way to really know which test is best is to sit for both practice tests and for us to put them, or you can find the concordance table online, put the scores into a concordance table and make that determination. But here are some ins and outs of both tests. So the SAT is considered to be a power test. And that means that it takes a lot of cognitive horsepower to get through the SAT, because although there are fewer questions, they're wordier. And they take longer to answer because you have to decipher first what they're asking of you. And then because the questions are longer, it just takes more time to answer each one. It's also called a power test because these questions require more critical thinking and analysis. The scope of skills is a little bit narrower on the SAT. For example, in math, you won't see any trig, whereas there are a few trig questions on the ACT. But the difficulty in the SAT is in the interpretation, understanding the questions and what they're asking you to do, both in the reading section and in the math section. On the SAT, it's going to feel different to kids because it's all about speed, meaning you have to go at that fast clip to get through everything to finish the test. So there are more questions, but they're shorter and they're really straightforward. So kids will often say, oh, this feels like stuff I do in school. These questions are considered student friendly. There is a slightly broader scope of skills, again, a little bit harder math, but math is only 1/4 of the ACT. There's 4 sections on the ACT, and math is only one of them. Whereas on the SAT, there are 2 sections, evidence-based reading and writing, and math. So math is half the test on the SAT. And again, the difficulty is in the pacing. It's in the speed. So if you have accommodations, really the ACT tends to be the most popular test, and we recommend it for students with extra time. So I mentioned that the ACT has 4 sections. Here they are. They are math. And on the ACT, you can use a calculator for the entire math section. Reading, it's reading comprehension, short and long passages. It's writing, but it's not a free write anymore. That was taken off both tests a few years ago. The only writing that you'll see on the ACT and the SAT is actually grammar, asking you to fix sentences. And then the last part is science. And so often kids say, science, I hate science. I'm not taking the ACT. There's just no way. I'm not good at science. I don't like physics. I didn't like chemistry. But the science section actually has no science that you've learned in school that you need to know. It has graphs and charts and asks you to extrapolate information from the data given. So you have to look at these graphs and charts and answer questions. And this is the most coachable section of the ACT. And we often see kids come to our practice where they have low science scores, and they're freaking out like, this is terrible, it's awful. But it's the most coachable section because once they get the hang of how to answer the questions, it becomes much easier for them. And with the ACT, as I mentioned, the total score, a perfect score is 36. And you get the score by averaging all 4 sections together. So not one part counts more than another. On each section, you get up to a 36, and then all those 4 parts are average. The test is long. It's 2 hours and 55 minutes. Pretty similar to the SAT, but a little bit shorter. All right, so let's stop and switch gears and talk about the SAT. The SAT has 2 sections, math, calculator, and no calculator. And kids really, they're so unsure about this because they are calculator dependent, a lot of students, and they don't know what to do when they do not have access to a calculator. But actually, even though on part of the test you cannot use a calculator, the College Board says these questions can absolutely be solved without a calculator. You don't need a calculator for these questions, but still it makes kids worried. But that is how the current math section is. It's half the test, and the best score you can get is 800 points. And then the other part of the test is called evidence-based reading and writing. And this part is also worth 800 points as a perfect score. There's reading, which is short and long passages, and there's writing, very similar to the ACT, mostly grammar. And then the total, the top score you can get is a combined 1,600 points, and it takes about 3 hours. All right, so let's come up with a strategy. How do you know when your child should take their first test? And what is a good time of year for kids to take tests? First of all, kids shouldn't be sitting for an actual test in their sophomore year. It's too early. They're going to get a score that is not reflective of their abilities, and it kind of bums kids out. So we really encourage kids not to take a test until their junior year. And when that rolls around, we encourage kids to pick 2 dates. So the reason you want to pick 2 dates is now you have a strategy. So you're going to determine when your first date is. And this is important. Your first date is a time of the year when you feel prepared. Statistically speaking, kids score their best in the spring of their junior year. So for a lot of kids, they'll take 2 spring tests, or maybe a January test and a spring test, or a spring test and then say a June test. Once you get your scores back from your first test, which takes about 2 weeks, then you're going to prepare again and then take it the second time. So popular ACT dates for juniors are April and June. Again, you prep up to your April date. You take the test, get your scores back 2 weeks later, look at your score, see, where did I get my lowest score? What section was it? Within that section, what was it? And then you're going to prepare with your weak areas, and then you'll take it again. Other popular times for the SAT are March and May. Same strategy, prep to the date, take it, get your scores back, look to see your weakest areas, prep in your weakest areas, and then take it again. And again, your best score will come in your junior year of the spring. I've seen a trend. It definitely started probably 5 years before COVID, where kids were coming to us and they wanted to take the test early and often. So they wanted to take tests very early in their junior year, really to get it out of the way. And then they wanted just to be done. But you're going to get, and that's fine. If you really want to take a test in the fall, you can. But don't forget, you're going to get your best score likely, or that's what the data tells us, in the spring. So take it again then, or maybe take it in the fall once and twice in the spring. And the reason is you're in school more, so you're exposed to learning more. You're older, you're more mature, and you have more curriculum under your belt. So you've had all these factors that age produces moving into your direction. So that's why you really want to take it again in the spring. Many kids will take it again in the late summer or the early fall of their senior year, and that's fine too. But my experience has been that if you want to do that, you really need to prep through the summer. Sometimes when kids haven't done anything academically over the summer and they take it again in the fall of their senior year and they're expecting a big increase, it doesn't happen because they haven't done anything all summer. So if you want to pick a fall senior date, which you can, I would definitely recommend doing prep up to that. So kids can take, even now if they're seniors, they can still take a test, and it can be in time for regular decision, which is a January or a mid-January date. They still have a little bit of time. And most kids will take the test 2 or 3 times. Anything more than that is kind of like a point of no return, and we tend not to see score increases when kids take it like 4 or 5 times. It's too much. So I would recommend getting help with your testing plan. We are happy to help you. I have a test prep specialist. I have a couple actually, Jennifer and Aaron. They work with parents and kids to help determine, based on the math they're taking, based on their grades, based on all their extracurriculars, based on their AP test schedule, when would be a good time for that student to take it twice. When is a good time out of the year? So we'll help you develop your testing plan. And we'll help you, walk you through the mock tests, all that stuff, so that you feel confident and prepared. All right, so I've said all this with the idea that tests are in their current form, that they're in paper and pencil. So right now, when students go to sit for a test, they get a test booklet and they get a Scantron sheet and they have a pencil. And just like we did when we were kids, they're filling in the Scantron sheet the old-fashioned way. But things are changing. So the College Board has announced the SAT is going digital. And we expect that the ACT is going to follow suit very soon, because the SAT is already doing all their international testing digital. So here's what's going to happen. In the fall of 2023, so in October of next year, the PSAT is going to kick us off, and that's going to be That's going to be digital. Then in the spring of 2023, you're also going to see some AP courses. And by the way, if I didn't mention this, the College Board produces the SAT, the PSAT, and all the AP exams. They're also going to release about 5 AP tests that are going to be digital. But the biggest change is going to come in the spring of 2024. So if your child is going to be a junior in the spring of 2024, they're going to take a digital SAT. Now, you might be wondering, how is this the same as the current test and what's different? So here's what's the same. It's still going to be a 1,600 point scale. And it's going to be proctored at school or a test site. So it's not like your child is going to be sitting in their room, on their bed, under the covers, taking an SAT test. They still go to school and they're still going to take it in a very traditional environment. And we're going to also see the same accommodations that kids get now. Extra time. Sometimes kids can have a reader. Sometimes kids can have all, I can't even think of all the other accommodations, because one of them was that the kids could write in their test booklet. So that's going to be different too. So accommodations will be the same in the digital format, except for a couple that will go away, like test booklet. But the general subject matter is going to be the same. What's changing? First of all, it's going to be totally digital. So there won't be any pencils or on Scantron sheets. It's also going to be shorter, which I love. Right now, as I mentioned, it's 3 hours and it's going to be around 2 hours. I personally think this is way better for kids. You can get a test score from data in 2 hours. And so this is going to take a lot of stress off of kids. And the long reading passages, and part of the reason it was so long is in the reading section, there are really long reading passages that you need to read a couple of times in order to get the meaning. Those are going to be shortened. So all the passages will be short on the digital version. And kids will be able to use a calculator on the entire math section. So the no calculator section will go away. The College Board is also saying that it's going to be more secure. So it's going to be a unique test for each student. Right now, kids get the same test, and it's very common for students in the same sitting to have the same test. But it's going to be different because there's going to be a different digital test created for every student. And the other thing that I love, in addition to it being shorter, is that it's going to be offered more frequently. So right now, the test is offered most months, not every month, but most months. The problem with that is that you then have to wait for your scores, and you can only take it in certain times of the year. But now it's going to be offered a lot more frequently. So kids are going to have much more choice in terms of when they're going to take it. And they're also going to be able to get their scores back in just a few days rather than 2 weeks, which it currently is. So no more waiting on pins and needles to see how your student does on the test. So what should you do now? First, if you have a child who's a sophomore, I would say wait until the spring. But if you have a child who hasn't engaged in any test prep yet and they're a junior, this is a good time to take a mock test. And then if you want to take it through us or you take it somewhere else, that's fine. We'll help to put it in a concordance table, and we'll set up a call with you to determine which test is going to be best for your child. Or we'll ask the student, which one do you feel most comfortable with? And then we'll help you pick test dates. You're going to pick 2 test dates. If you decide that you want us to help your student with test preparation, we'll get you matched with a test prep coach who specializes in these tests and can help your student improve their scores. And then once that happens, Your student will prepare weekly leading up to the test. And this approach is much better for the vast majority of kids rather than a boot camp. Sometimes parents will say, oh, I saw this class, it's over the weekend. Or, they go to class for, 2 4-hour days. And it's hard for your brain to work like that. It's much better for your brain to learn information over time. That puts it into long-term memory rather than just cramming for something right before the test date. We used to do boot camps, and then we looked at the scores and the data and found that actually they weren't very helpful. But when kids study over time, usually it's a couple months out, sometimes 3. If they need more help, they have more room to make up. If they need to improve their score a lot, it might be a little bit longer than that. But we work with kids weekly, and then we'll assign a little bit of homework for them to do so that they're practicing over time. And if we can help you, you can learn more by scanning this, and we're happy to set up a call with you to talk about your child. And you can learn more on the test prep page of our website, where you can look at our diagnostic test information. There's information on the assessment that we do when we talk to you and help you create a plan, and then how we structure the sessions. And then lastly, I wanted to mention that as kids go through high school, thinking about college can be really daunting. And even if your child, is a really strong student, and even if you've got it all under control, there inevitably are glitches along the way. So we prepared a college checklist to help kids, whether they're a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, on certain things that they need to do at each grade level. And you can get that straight to your inbox by texting 55444 and the word college, and it will be emailed to you. So tonight we talked a lot about testing. We talked a lot about the SAT and a lot about the ACT, but that's just part of the application. In this test optional environment, there are other things kids can also do to help their student, or to help themselves stand out. And one is grades and narrative. So grades are the most important factor, hands down, than anything else. It doesn't matter. Grades are the biggest factor. And schools are looking for rigor. Did you challenge yourself? If you say you want to apply to the engineering school, did you take the very top, the most competitive math classes and the most challenging science classes? That's what rigor is. Did you challenge yourself the most you could? And then what are your grades? So not so much your grades in marketing or PE, but more, what are your grades in core classes, specifically those challenging classes? And then outside of grades, there's something called the narrative. It's also called the human component. And as admissions has become more competitive, colleges are now looking to see what your differentiator is. Since most kids have really good grades, what is it about you? And that's called the human component. So every child should be creating a narrative. What is unique to them? What's special about them? And this is reflected in their essays, their extracurriculars, and their summer activities. And then also recommendations are a factor as well. Teacher and counselor recommendations. So right now, what should 9th and 10th graders do? And I know we don't have any parents and 9th graders on the call, but we did have 10th graders, is to focus on grades, be super diligent about test course selection, which occurs in the spring, super important for your junior year. And now, even now, start thinking about extracurriculars and the summer. What is your child going to do over the summer? Even if it's get a summer job and they want to apply to an engineering school, or they want to apply to film school, or they want to be a teacher, those things should be reflected in what they do over the summer, even if it's a volunteer role. Those are important. Or extracurriculars they do now, that can contribute to the narrative if it's in line with what their focus is. And they can also start thinking about mock tests. 11th graders, again, grades are the most important. Make sure you have a solid testing plan with 2 dates selected. Continue with your theme. Again, this is your narrative. Think about your summer, and then start to creating your list, making sure that you have a balanced list of reach, safety, and those middle framework or mid-tier schools that are right in the middle for you. What we've seen more recently is that kids are applying to a lot of reach schools because they think, oh, test scores don't matter so much, I'll just apply to all these schools, and they're really reach schools. And that's why all these schools are seeing so many more applications that they may not have applied to in the past. And so we're seeing a lot of top heavy lists, kids that come to us for our college counseling program. And we have to really work with them to balance it out. So they usually don't have enough of those framework, those target schools. And oftentimes their safety schools are schools that they don't even really like. And you should not have schools on your list that you don't really like, or that that don't really interest you. Just kind of put them there. We want to make sure that kids have a really good balanced list. And then seniors, right now, they're really completing their applications. They're weaving their theme into their essays, and they're on track for their regular decision deadline, which is at most schools January 1st and sometimes January 15th. So we're happy to help you. Certainly, I talked about test preparation. We also have 3 college counselors that work with our students, starting with kids in 8th grade through 10th grade on course selection, their high school resume, study skills, career exploration. And then in 11th grade, we help them refine their list. We help them create their testing plans. We help them to schedule college visits, interview prep, help with essay ideas and editing, and above all, create that narrative. That's the most important thing. And you can learn more about our college counseling at our website, ectutoring.com, and we have a drop down for college counseling. And if we can help your student, Erin is our test prep director or our college counseling director, and you can schedule with her directly. She's awesome. She's worked with me for 12 years, and she really knows her stuff. All right, well, thanks everybody. I'm going to wrap up now and go to Q&A. So if you have a question, please throw it in the chat. Again, my name is Ann Dolan, and it was a pleasure to speak to you this evening. So let me go over to Q&A. And also one other thing, when we're done tonight, you'll see a survey pop up on your screen. And if you would be so kind as to complete that survey, I would truly help. That would be so helpful to me to see what was helpful to you. All right, so let's see. How many practice SAT and ACT tests would you recommend for a student to take? When you're determining whether you should take the SAT or the ACT, they just need to take one of each. And then as they have a tutor and they're practicing, we recommend that kids take a couple more practice tests because they help us to understand where the student is doing well and where they still need to improve. And earlier I mentioned that when you get test scores back and you look for weak areas, that's the best way to increase your score. A lot of kids think I'll just practice for everything, and that's not how it is. You're going to improve your score the most if you look at those weakest areas and you prep for them, because it's likely moving your top scores a little bit higher isn't going to move the needle. It's really moving those lower scores higher that helps elevate your score the most. So within a program, a student might take a practice test a couple more times. Let's see. I think that's all the questions that we have. Janet, I would love to turn it back over to you.
And thank you so much for being here. And for those of you on the line, I do suggest that you check out Anne's website. She has a wealth of information that I have taken advantage of. Wonderful tips, a number of resources. I subscribe to her. And do you call it a blog or a newsletter?
I call it a newsletter.
Yeah, I've just gotten so much out of that, and I've also I've never shared this with Anne, but I did get a copy of her book, which I thought was fabulous. So so I'm a big fan, and thank you so much for joining us on behalf of the Yorktown PTA. I'd like to thank everybody for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a great evening.